The Hero's Journey, a Mindful Accord podcast, with your host, Rich Decker.
Hello, and thank you for taking some of your valuable time to listen to the show. If you enjoy this show and have been inspired by this episode or another episode, I would encourage you to join our Patreon page. For those who are unfamiliar with Patreon, it's a platform that allows artists and content creators to build relationships with their audience, while at the same time earning enough money to keep providing the content. When you join our community, you will gain access to exclusive content such as live guest Q&As, behind the scenes, and other exclusive offers. And you can join for as little as $1 per month. There's a link in the show notes that'll take you directly to our page. Our guest for this episode is Pirie Grossman. Pirie is a TEDx speaker, author, and a soul-centered life coach. As a former actress, she spent 20 years in front of a camera. Pirie was a reporter for E! Entertainment Television, Entertainment Tonight, and also hosted ABC's Every Woman. At that time, she was married to one of the biggest and most successful movie producers in Hollywood. On the outside, all this appeared to be a perfect and successful life. However, this was not the case, for this is when the darkness set in, and she slowly descended into the abyss. Pirie was in the darkest place that a person can be. This led to her suicide attempt by swallowing 250 pills. Fortunately, she survived, and from this place of despair, she was able to transform all that darkness into light. She has gone on to do such things as be a co-chair for the Special Olympics International World Winter Games in Idaho, and has spoke at the UN on behalf of Special Olympics. She is the founder of the Love is Louder Brain Health Summit with suicide survivor Kevin Hines, focusing on teenage depression and suicide. She has her master's in spiritual psychology from the University of Santa Monica, and is a highly successful coach. This is the hero's journey of Pirie Grossman. Enjoy. Well, thank you, Pirie. Thank you for joining us today on the Hero's Journey, a Mindful Accord podcast. I heard you speak a few weeks ago at a conference, and when you were sharing part of your story, I said, I have to get her on my podcast. So thank you for coming on the podcast. And I want to start out with where you started in your journey. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, and then perhaps something I ask everyone that comes on the show, I just find it interesting, is what's one thing that your parents instilled in you that either for better or worse that you still carry with you today, and perhaps something that may have gotten you through the difficult times?
That's a good question. Well, my childhood was very unusual because my parents were unusual. So I've had an amazing, colorful childhood. My parents were young when they had me. My mom was only 21. My dad was 25. And this was in the 50s in South Texas. And my dad was in the music business, and he owned a roller skating rink because the military academy was in South Texas at the time. And he loved entertainment. So he became friends with Johnny Cash and all these guys before they became really popular. And he was able to bring them in to do these live shows for the Marine Military Academy guys. And he became friends with them, started hanging out with them. So the house with my mom and dad was always a party house. There was a lot of drinking going on. There was a lot of drugs. I was pretty much raised by my housekeeper at the time. And my mom, we didn't know until later, but she was dealing with a lot of mental illness. And so she wasn't really in my life early on. My dad, however, was. And he was a very charismatic guy and just believed, that the world was your oyster. You could create anything you wanted. And he had so much fun, was very, just a positive man. And I think his spirit was something that I took on in my life. He did wear the rose-colored glasses, which I probably inherited. as well. So it was a life of fun, and then it was also a life of uncertainty. I wasn't quite sure, and I didn't ever really quite feel safe until a little bit later on. And there is an incident that did occur, which I will share with you. So it just kind of sets the pace of how my life started. About, I guess, 5 years later, we moved from a little town called San Benito into Harlingen. And my dad he left the entertainment business and he decided to get into real estate. So he was gone quite a bit. And my mom was home. And I also had a younger brother. And like I said, my mom was dealing with a lot of demons. And one afternoon, she came into my brother's and my bedroom and said to me, "Pirie, I want you to come and follow me outside for a minute." Now, I always checked her eyes, Rich, because I became a little warrior at a very young age. I knew that if my mother's eyes were kind and happy and twinkling, she was going to be okay. But if they were dark, intense, I knew something was going to happen that was not going to be good. So she did have that dark, intense look in her eyes. So I followed her outside. We got in the backyard and she told me to kneel down. She put my face in the dirt and she took out a gun. And she put the gun in the back of my head and she said she was going to have to kill me because my father loved me more than her. And I remember just being so scared, begging her not to do it. Next thing you know, she was gone. She just walked away. Now, as a 5-year-old, where was I supposed to go? And a lot of people said, "Why didn't you run?" She said, "But you don't think like that as a 5-year-old." So I went back into my bedroom and I fell asleep. Well, pretty soon my mother came back in the room again. And when I looked into her eyes, she had the sparkle eyes, the friendly eyes. And she came and she kneeled down next to me and she says, "Honey, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I was just trying to scare you," and just all these words are spilling out. And she says, "I love you, but can you do me a favor and not tell your father?" And then she walked out of the bedroom. When my father came home a couple hours later and checked on me, and I didn't say anything. Then he went back outside and he came back in my room because he could sense something was wrong. And he said, "Honey, what's wrong?" So I told him. Well, what transpired after that was my dad went into the other part of the house and he and my mother started arguing. I remember my dad came in and had dinner for us and my mom was still in her room. Well, the next day, I saw them come and put a straitjacket around my mother and take her out of the house. And what had happened is that my father had to have her committed to a mental institution for 3 years for that act. So I immediately felt like it was my fault that my mother had to leave. And by the way, her looks and the way she looked at me, because our eyes met before she left, and she said, "This is your fault." So I carried a lot of guilt, and I felt like I also had a tremendous amount of power for a young little girl. So when she left, my dad and I, my brother, all became very, very close. I ended up wanting to sell Christmas cards. Remember those Christmas card packs that you found in the back of magazines you could fill out and go sell them door to door? And by that time I was 6 and I knocked on a preacher's door. And I not only wanted to sell him some Christmas cards, but I wanted to know if he had any kids I could play with. And he did. He had 2 daughters, pretty close to my age. But more importantly, I knocked on the door of a family that became my second family and actually where I learned about God for the first time in my life. And that belief in God was my safety, become my safety and my faith from that point on.
What was your mother's mental illness? Was she schizophrenic?
Yes, schizophrenic, bipolar. She, when I became this little strong Christian girl, and she came home after 3 years, I brought her to the church and she became a Christian as well. She was put on a lot of drugs. She went through shock therapy. She went through a lot of things to just try to be okay. And she suffered with a lot of, drinking and drugs and just had a darkness about her. But when she did start going to church, she actually had accepted God in her life as well. And it changed her. There was a lot more light to her. She was a lot more hope. We developed a relationship as I grew up, not a very close one, because I still didn't quite trust her. There was still some behavior that didn't feel normal, but I felt safer. And I knew that my dad was always there. My dad was the one who buffered my brother and I with our mother, just in the sense of wanting to make sure she was going to be okay, wouldn't do some behaviors that was scary or any of those things. Because sometimes she'd do some things that, honest to goodness, Rich, I don't think she even knew. And she certainly didn't know how to curb them. As far as feeling safe, that part helped tremendously through my dad and also through the church, quite frankly.
Many people, maybe not then, but now, would probably not stay in that situation, meaning like a divorce or something. What was his reasoning for sticking it out and bringing your mom back home?
That's the part I just amazed. I mean, my dad, he represented unconditional love in all facets, in all areas of his life, and with all relationships in his life. And they loved each other. They really loved each other. And I also think because of God in their lives, it kept them together. They had a lot of fun together. At the same time, you could look at it that way. And then there's the other side of it. There was a lot of things that were very dysfunctional in that relationship. But he had a belief that when things got tough, you worked through them. And he was also quite a prayer warrior. He just passed away about 6 years ago. My mother's still living. He definitely was the glue in this family that we had, and was definitely a bright shining star of unconditional love.
Well, that is a true testament to unconditional love, because I don't know if my wife pulled a gun on my daughter and said, "I'm going to kill you." I don't know if I could stay with that woman.
I agree. And it took a lot of forgiveness, compassion. My dad didn't know how sick my mom was, and he worked through a lot of that, a lot of trust. It was something that I think he had to learn. I think he had to really learn. All of his kids were marveled by it, though, just how much he loved her and trusted her. And he also shared with me later in life, he said, I carried so much guilt and felt so badly that I had to have your mom committed. He said, but I knew I had to protect you kids. He says, and I was hoping that they could help her and that she could always come back home. And in those days, treating mental illness in the 60s is very different than how we treat it today.
Sure. You mentioned shock therapy. For one, I don't know how much they do that now, but I don't think much.
No. And, and she talked about it a lot when she came home, and she grew and learned about herself and learned, what she could do to help her. I also learned to have some compassion for her.
Well, how can you not? I mean, it's not something that's in her control.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. And I think that's where a lot of stigma comes in with mental illness. People think that you have control over it, but you don't. And nowadays we do have a lot more tools and techniques and medicine that can help people, because it is a disease.
Yeah, it's a disease that, I mean, my brother is actually schizophrenic, and I don't know how, it's been a while now, but I know a few years ago that they made some improvements in the medication and it helped him tremendously, but it's still always there.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So growing up in that environment, when you were a little girl, we all want to be ballerina or a rock star or fireman or firewoman. What did you want to be when you were growing up?
Oh gosh. My dad always said to me, honey, the world is your oyster. You could do anything that you want and be anything you want. And he really instilled that in me. And my mother did too. And I remember one time, being raised in Texas, the goal at that time was to uh, be a Dallas cheerleader or to, marry an oil man or marry a president or something like that. And I remember some of my girlfriends were talking about it. My mom looked at me and she said, or you could be the president. And that was unusual, very progressive thinking back then. But oh my gosh, I think the first thing I wanted to do, you're going to laugh, is when I sold Christmas cards, then I went into, the DECA clubs and learned all about business. I always wanted to be a CEO of my own company that was a multi-million-dollar company. That was something that was instilled in me because I loved business when I was very young. And then I watched, remember the TV show Charlie's Angels?
Oh, how could you not?
Right? Well, I wanted to be Jacqueline Smith. I thought that would be pretty cool to move to LA and have fun television series. Well, then from there, I think my last goal at the time was, you remember Mary Hart on Entertainment Tonight? And I thought, okay, now how about, because I'm not a very good actress, so how about hosting? So in those days, those were some of the glamorous roles that I always wanted to play and live in my fantasy world.
So did that attraction to the entertainment industry, was that, you think it came from your father being involved in the music industry?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. He was a showman. I mean, he used to, open and announce all these great country acts, and we traveled around with the groups. And like I said, he was very charismatic. And my mom, was a concert pianist. So I think I got a little bit of both from them.
Tell me a little more about your second family. That sounds interesting.
It was a pastor, and they were amazing. I had never heard the concept of God. My parents, my mother was an atheist, a real atheist, and my father was an agnostic. So hearing about God and hearing about Jesus or hearing about church or anything like that, it was so foreign to me. But all I remember is that this man and his wife and his kids, because I would go to church with them by myself every Sunday morning, and the feeling of family and the feeling of belonging to a community and the feeling of safety, and that there really was someone who was watching over us. And I think my dad used to tell me a story. I remember when he had the skating rink and I felt alone, and I could look from my back bedroom window and see across the way was the skating rink. It wasn't that far from our house, just literally across the street. And I remember there was a big full moon, and I didn't want to go to bed. I wanted to be with them, and I was afraid of being alone. And he said, do you see that big moon up there? And I said, yes. And he said, there's a man in the moon. And that man in the moon is watching over you. He said, so you're never alone. And that man in the moon, if he thinks that I need to get back here, he's going to tell me, and I can walk across the street and be right here with you in a second. And I hung on to that. And I remember when I went to church and I heard about God, I would think about the man in the moon was God. And it was just a feeling, like I said, of safety and love. And I think for a little girl that, this traumatic experience had happened to, and my family was just split apart, that was what was most important. And my dad eventually started going to church with us. It helped him as well, just to feel centered and to feel like, help him deal with some of the stuff that he was dealing with the guilt and am I doing the right thing? And you remember he was only 28, 29 years old when he had to make that decision. That's pretty young to make a decision that big for a woman that you love.
Well, it certainly is. We think we're adults, but I think I just became an adult maybe a couple years ago, honestly.
I know the feeling. Me too, Rich.
I still struggle with it. So do you have any contact with your second family at all at this point?
No, I lost track of them when I was in high school in South Texas. I'm not sure where they are or what they're doing, but I tried to find them through Facebook one time, but I didn't have any success.
Did they influence you for your choice to go to Oral Roberts University? Because that's a very conservative school.
Yes, I know they didn't. That was a whole other situation. So, of course, my parents stopped drinking. They stopped partying. They stopped doing drugs while I was growing up. And when I turned 16, I was going to go visit my aunt and uncle who lived in Mountain Home, Idaho. So my younger sister, who was born after my mom came home, we went and spent a summer with my aunt and uncle. My uncle was a pilot for the Air Force. And we came out here, and then he took us to Sun Valley and took us all around the areas without me knowing that one day I would be living here. Isn't that interesting? And we went to a youth group on the military base, and there was a very cute boy singing, playing the guitar, and he was also 16 years old. And his family, his dad was the chaplain at the Air Force Base, and his family told me about Oral Roberts University. And I remember thinking, because I was on my way, I was actually just accepted into Wharton School of Business because my dad's accountant friend. And of course, my whole business dad, I loved that. And then all of a sudden I hear about Oral Roberts University and about singing and how great it is. And it looks like a space age campus. And of course, there was that cute boy. So I came back home to South Texas after my trip and told my parents, and they looked at me like, what? Where is this? And so we went and visited the campus, and it did look like a complete science fiction campus. And I spent some time, I met some kids, and I just loved the feel. And I think I also was unconsciously choosing that because it was a little closer to home to Texas than, the East Coast was. So I thought, well, I'm going to try it for a year and see if I like it. And I did. And I met Oral himself. I saw just the amazing work that he did. I loved the classes and the people there. So I ended up staying there. I was on the 5-year plan, and I got my Bachelor of Science in Business Marketing. And then from there, I ended up in Dallas for a couple of years, and then I eventually made my way out to Los Angeles.
So when you were a young person, my nephew went to Oral Roberts. It's a very strict school, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's no shenanigans there. Is that correct?
Oh, there's lots of shenanigans.
Oh, is there? Kids will be kids, regardless.
Yeah. You know what they say about church kids. I mean, we had so much fun. But can I tell you, I have some lifelong friends with some of the kids that I went to school there. And it was a wonderful place to study. The teachers were incredible. They had to work harder. They're getting in some of the better teachers because they were still working on their accreditation. I'm glad I went. I mean, it certainly instilled even, greater values inside of me. And I was a late bloomer though. I did my partying after Oral Roberts University. I have to admit.
How did you end up in LA? I mean, did you still have that idea of wanting to be a host or being in the entertainment industry? Is that still part of it?
Well, when I was in Dallas for a nanosecond, I was taking some acting classes, and I ended up being an extra in one of Willie Nelson's films. And I met a producer, the redheaded stranger. And so I met the producer there, and he said to me, you should go to LA and do commercials and get into television, and you've got a great girl next door look. And I thought, yeah, that sounds great. So I did just for a couple of weeks. And he actually gave me the name of a casting director and gave me his number, he and his wife's number, and said, why don't you call us and, we'll see what we can do. So I went out there, called them, and they set up an appointment with this Sheila Manning. I remember her name. It's a casting agent out there. And so I met her, and she and I really liked each other. And she brought me in on a couple auditions, and one was for Bud Light and Bud Light Girls and Spuds McKenzie and all that. So I ended up booking my first national commercial while just on a visit in LA. And so I immediately got the bug, and I thought, oh my gosh, I can do this. This is fun. So I eventually decided I was going to stay. And so it was really because of booking commercials that helped support me financially. And of course, my dad helped me too. Started taking acting classes. And that's when I became very aware of really how not a great actress I was.
That was not your
No,
calling?
it wasn't my calling. I mean, if I could play myself, which I did a couple soaps, and it was fun, but I always played myself. It was the girl next door. But at that time, with the commercials, it ended up being very profitable for me. So I loved it.
There's thousands of stories of young women, young men going to Hollywood. How did you, what do you think separated you that made you get in and be successful? What quality did you have?
I think it goes back to what your first question was. Was there anything that my parents taught me or instilled in me that set me apart? And I did truly believe that I could do anything. And if I set my mind to it and I really wanted it, and I could just show up and be myself. And that was one thing my dad always said to me also, is says, just be yourself. That's enough. And so I believed it. And I had an easy way whenever we would audition and they would, tell you to be a certain person or act a certain way or just read some copy. I knew how to be myself. I just knew what made that work for me. And that's probably why I wasn't a good actress, is because I couldn't be anybody else. I had to just be myself. And I think that was the quality that had me stand out with other people in booking the shows and the commercials and things that I did.
Well, I have to touch on this in light of the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein and all that. Did you experience that as well in your time there?
I did. But I remember there was another conversation my dad had with me before I went to California. He's so funny. He says, remember, honey, and this is from a Texan, remember, honey, California is like a granola bar. It's full of fruits, nuts, and flakes. And so
That's funny.
he and my mom both sat me down ahead of time and said, it's going to be some interesting people because, they knew a lot of people in California too and in the business. And they said, you don't ever have to do anything you don't want to do. And if you feel uncomfortable, you don't do it. Just say, thank you very much, but no. And taught me how to say no. So when situations, and by the way, it can be pretty interesting because you could be in the middle of, reading for something. And this is particularly in acting. And they'd ask you, there's going to be some nudity. Do you mind? Or, you maybe won't have your shirt on. There might be a pool scene or whatever. So you had to know ahead of time who you were, what your values were, what you were uncomfortable with and what you weren't. And I did know that. So whenever those questions came to me, I would say, no, I'm not comfortable with that. I won't do it. And there was always, some producers, somebody, hey, well, you want to come over and meet me for dinner and we'll go over the script. And I remember I fell for that one time. And ended up at the Beverly Hills Hotel in the lobby bar there. And I started feeling uncomfortable. And so I just, got up and left. And I mean, you'll get that feeling inside. Everybody knows when it's, when it feels like it's coming on. And I think you have to set your values and intentions ahead of time. That was just for me. Now, I'm sure there's other instances where people have surprise attacks or surprise situations, and, it's hard to get out of them. And my heart goes out to them because I know it does happen. It's happened to some of my friends too. But I was fortunate enough that it didn't happen to me like that.
Did you ever suffer repercussions from saying no?
No. I mean, there was a couple parts that I lost, but that's okay because for me, like I said, I just knew who I was, what I would be comfortable with, and being outside of that box was not a comfort zone for me.
So you can do this and you don't have to compromise your values and your beliefs.
I believe you can. Yes.
How did you end up being on entertainment television? I'm sure I've seen you. I don't remember, but I watched that back then.
Well, it was a casting call. We were Movie Time before we were E. And this was in 1988. And I was working on a game show with a friend of mine before that. And I almost didn't go on the audition because I was going to have to miss part of this, working on this game show. Of course, there was not much of a career there other than great money. But I went into this warehouse and did this audition. And it was the very first time E started in the cable business. So I worked as a reporter. So I was, visiting sets and interviewing actors and directors, producers on location. And then we were bought out with MTV and we became E. And this was in 1990. So then they moved me from being an outdoor reporter to indoor host. So I did a show called Coming Attractions, and every once in a while I would substitute for Greg Kinnear on Talk Soup, and Katie Wagner was working with us. We had the news. So we were actually the very first ones outside of the VH1 talent that started the concept of the host. So I worked for them for years. Loved it. I had so much fun traveling the world, meeting people, enjoying just the LA life, and so grateful that I was getting a paycheck and doing something that I really love doing.
Now, I wanted to ask you, since you were in that world and left it, why do you think, I'm curious, I just don't understand our culture sometimes, but why do you think we worship celebrities so much and put such a high value on someone that appears on TV? And that's no disrespect to anybody in the industry. I don't understand it.
Yeah. Being in it, I think, and being and wanting to be into the business, and actually enjoying the small success of a celebrity, that I had. I think celebs represent our fantasies, of what it must look like to have it all. Fame, being adored, love, money, success. And I think it's just a fantasy that people think that, being a celebrity means you've just arrived. You're completely successful in life. And so you must be happy and enjoy it. And how could you not? And, there's a real fantasy about all of it.
From your experience, the people that quote unquote became successful, how many of them were actually happy and enjoyed it?
There's all kinds of them, but the ones that I met and became friends with and got to know, we're all humans, and we're all messy humans. So there's moments of great happiness and joy and excitement that you have the job and you have this life. But if you're just looking for that to be your fix and your definition for happiness, it doesn't last long, because deep inside is where I believe you have to have the intention of happiness and truly have joy. You're not caught up in all of the external environment, because when that goes away, you're just left with you. You're just left with who you are. And is that enough? And are you happy with who you are? You meet all kinds, and it's not just in the entertainment business. I mean, I meet people who are like that in the banking business, or people even in the wellness business. Just because they're in something doesn't necessarily mean that they are.
Well, I've learned through my own journeys that life is an inside job. There's no external anything that will give you any kind of lasting type of contentment or satisfaction.
Exactly. Exactly.
How did you meet your first husband? He was a movie producer?
Yes, he was. We were at a restaurant. I was celebrating a birthday, and it was one of those things, looking across each other and locking eyes, and it was love at first sight. And he was a very successful movie producer. Michael Douglas was his partner, and he produced movies like Pretty Woman and Dirty Dancing and Face Off and a lot of movies. And so I was working on at E, and he was over at Warner Brothers. So we got married. He had a darling little girl. She was only 4 years old, who I fell in love with. Lived in Bel Air, had a great life. It was not uncommon to have a lot of movie stars over for dinner as friends, and then also people that he wanted to talk to and hopefully get them signed on to whatever movie he was working on. So we had a fun life up to a point, and at that point, I also retired from E because he wanted me to be more full-time wife and to be able to travel with him when he was doing, his productions of movies and stuff, and also be a full-time stepmother to his daughter. So that was in the, oh goodness, I guess it was about 94 for about 5 years. Yeah, so that was the pinnacle of success in Hollywood at the time, I thought.
To be that in that position?
Yes, yes.
What would you call the pinnacle of success in Hollywood now?
Well, I think now, as I've learned too, is having, you can be successful in life as being successful as a human being, and really looking at yourself. Are you happy within yourself? And at that time, I know I was living, and I know he was living too, the same way. As the pinnacle of success was wealth, success in, business, success in how things looked, success in having, a beautiful home and a lot of things and first class travel, and all of that is that external environment I talked about. You can get lost in that and get caught up in that. And I did, certainly with him. And so now I have to tell you, before this, I never wanted children, Rich. I was afraid I would not be a good mother because I didn't really see or have a role model of what a mother was. I had fear of it. So I thought, I love being a working girl. I love having a stepdaughter. This would be enough. But as I fell in love with both of them and I saw the deep connection that they had, and by the way, I had my own deep connection with her, and she taught me how to be a child again. And I remember asking him, what do I do with her? What do I say? And he said, don't worry, she'll show you. And she did. This little beautiful 4-year-old little girl took my hand, and she reintroduced myself to being a child again, and the sense of play and wonder and fun. And I think I, because of my experience when I was young, I grew up very quickly, and I didn't know how to be a child anymore. So I kind of skipped that part of it and became an adult very quickly, a little warrior very quickly. And I carried that throughout my life until I met, my sweet little stepdaughter. So from then on, it was awakened in me that I wanted to be a mom. And so Steve and I talked about, having a child, and we were very excited about it. we tried desperately, naturally, couldn't do it. Then we tried IVF and with myself, and I soon learned that I couldn't carry. So then we hired 2 different surrogates, and they couldn't even get pregnant. Once you start on that train of IVF and all of the drugs and wanting to be a mother, it's very hard to get off of it. And I, being the A personality that I am, and I like success, and I was just going to push through it. You're only supposed to do, IVF maybe once, procedure maybe once every 4 or 5 months. Well, I became very determined, and so I would do them every other month. So within a year, I had 8 IVF procedures and retrievals. Finally, my body was so exhausted. And the last egg retrieval that they did touched a nerve, and I started having some internal bleeding. So I went back to our home after doctor's office on this last one, fell asleep, and I woke up and I was just feeling terrible. And went into the restroom, I was just bleeding everywhere. So they rushed me to the hospital. Basically, I had a vein that had been ruptured because I was doing so many IVF procedures at one time that the walls had become weak. And I went into a coma, and I had about 4 blood transfusions, and I was down to 95 pounds. Became very hard in that last year that we were trying to have a baby. Steve and I started just growing apart, and he was very frustrated with the fact that not only were we not getting pregnant, but he felt like he was losing his wife and wanted me to stop. And that just crushed me, hearing those words that he wanted me to stop. And I couldn't. And then I started talking to him about adoption, and he just laughed. He didn't want to hear anything about adoption. It was either we were going to have it on our own or that was it. So I came home from that one terrible retrieval time, and I had a friend who was a producer, and he was worried about me, and he said, "You know what? We need to get you back to work." Now, this is part of the story I didn't tell from the stage. So he had a TV show called Every Woman, and basically he was looking for interviewers to go and interview very successful women in the world and share their stories. So he told me, he said, "I need you to get back to work. If you get back to work, you'll start feeling better and get your mind off of trying to have babies and get you healthy again." And that seemed like a really good idea. So I said, okay. So my first assignment was to go to North Carolina and meet with Maya Angelou. And at the time, I hadn't read any of her books. So as I was recouping and getting my body stronger, I was doing intense, work and reading all about her books and about her, because my producer told me, he said, "Now listen, when you get there, you have to get her involved." And she's basically only agreed to answering 3 questions. And if those 3 questions are not good, that's going to be the end of the interview. And at the time, they needed to build an hour-long show. I thought, okay, great, no pressure here. So I started getting healthier, started feeling stronger physically and emotionally, and it was smart for me to do something different. And so I went out there, flew out there with our crew. I met her at a television station. We sat down and started talking, and we just connected in a really big way. So we went well beyond 3 questions. We ended up doing a 3-hour interview. And at the end of the 3 hours, she said, "Where are you going for lunch?" And I thought, "Why? I don't know, probably somewhere around the studio." And she said, "Why don't you come to my house?" She goes, "I'll fix you and your crew lunch." And I thought, really? Maya Angelou is going to fix us lunch? I said, okay. And she got herself unmiked and she gave me a big hug and she says, I want to visit with you. I said, okay. And she goes, it's personal. And I said, all right. So we went back to her house and we were walking in the backyard. And she has beautiful sculptures in her backyard. And she started telling me the story with each piece. And we sat down on a bench and she took my hand and she says, how are you? And I said, I'm good, keeping a stoic kind of front. And she said, no. She goes, when I look at you, I see a lot of pain. And I started crying. And she said, she says, if you don't want to talk about it, that's okay. And I said, no, I'll talk to you about it. So I told her struggles of trying to have a child together. And I felt like I was losing my husband. And I felt like I was losing my life. And she said something to me and she was wonderful, but she did say something, it was a little prophetic. And she said, she said, we're much stronger than what we think we are. She says, but I have a feeling your situation's going to get worse. She said, but I want you to know you're strong enough to handle it. And she said, you are a communicator. You know how to talk for those that don't. She goes, you can be a voice for those people that don't have a voice. And she says, it's going to get harder. She goes, but I'm going to give you my phone number, my email. You call me anytime you need to talk and you need encouragement. She goes, I'll be there for you. And I was blown away by that. But I could tell she meant it because I really felt in that short period of time, she did care about me. So we went back in the house and had this great lunch. And then she took me to the front of the room, her living room. And there was a beautiful handmade quilt that was up on the wall. And she said, do you know who gave me that? I said, no. And she goes, Oprah Winfrey. She says, Oprah and I met the same way you and I did here. And she said, she's like my daughter. And she said, she has a voice. She has a voice for others who can't speak up for themselves. And she goes, I want you to remember that. And, told me things like God gave me a gift and communication and connectivity. And she just made me feel great and gave me more confidence in myself. So I went back to LA and turned in the piece, and they were excited. They ended up doing 2 parts instead of just one. And I thought about our conversation many times. Well, then I was signed up to do another IVF. It was our last one, and into this other surrogate. So we did, and ended up, it was painful and my body was so worn out. And again, I was put back in the hospital. So this time my husband came to me and he said, this has got to stop. I'm done. And I need you to stop trying to have a child. Says we're done. So I came back home from the hospital and he said he wanted to take he and his daughter to Sun Valley, which is where we had a second home, for a long weekend. It was over Labor Day weekend. I couldn't go because I couldn't travel, which I thought was kind of sad that he knew I was in bad shape, but he needed to get away. So I was alone there at the house for 4 days, and my sister came and stayed with me for a while. And that's when I started spiraling down, Rich. And there was this darkness that I had never felt. I don't think I ever felt that kind of despair and depression. And it was this intensity of darkness and hopelessness that I hadn't felt ever. And I knew I was never going to be a mom. That's what I told myself. I knew my marriage was in trouble. And this was the biggest failure that I'd ever felt. Well, after a couple of days, and by the way, my husband never checked on me those days at all, which made it feel worse. So he came in. he dropped his daughter off with her mom, and he came over to me and he said, I've been thinking, and I don't want to do this anymore. I want a divorce. And I was shocked. And I said, okay, I'll give it up. I'll give up having a child. I mean, I just gave over to another human being. I was nothing. My dreams, my desires, everything, it fell away from me. And I thought, I'm just going to give up myself so I'm not left. And so that this person would love me, because I don't think I loved myself anymore. And he said, no, it's already done. The attorneys are writing up the papers. And he said, maybe it's a good idea if you go back to Texas and be with your parents and heal there, because we're done. And I remember thinking, I don't even know who this man is anymore. This was the love of my life. We had an amazing, loving marriage for years. And all of a sudden, this coldness came into him. I never saw it before. So I remember him walking upstairs to his office, and I was laying down on the sofa in our media room. And I sat down on the sofa and I just put my head in my hands and I just started crying. I was in tears, and it was those primal tears. And I felt so much pain, so much emotional pain, physical pain. And I thought, how am I going to start over again? And I looked at the whole roll of pills, bottles of pills that I had. And I just thought, I can't do it. And I instinctively just took all of those pills, over 250 of them. And I thought, I'm just going to end it. I'm going to go to sleep and I'm going to end it. And I took all of them. I laid down. And as I said from the stage that day, I just said a prayer. I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And just close my eyes. And hours later, I'd somehow made it up to our bed in bedroom. And I woke up vomiting, just so sick. And Steve was holding me, trying to contain me. And I heard voices and lights. And he called 911, and they came and they got me and they took me to Cedars-Sinai Hospital, pumped my stomach, and I was out of it for days. When I did finally wake up, remember there was a mental health provider that came and sat down with me and told me what I did. And I was shocked. I felt a lot of shame. I felt a lot of guilt. And I was just shocked that I had the capability of doing that, of trying to take my own life. And I remember thinking, why didn't I think about the words Maya had shared with me? Why didn't I remember those words? Why didn't I remember about my faith? Where was God in all this? Where was the light again? How could I succumb to such darkness? And it was that night, and I felt terrible, and I felt like I was not really alive yet. I remember laying there and thinking, wow, God, if you want to just take me, I'm pretty pathetic. You can take me. And then there was this nurse. She was this beautiful black big nurse, and she was sitting in a chair next to me, and she grabbed my hand and she said, "You're not going anywhere, darling." She says, "God's got something else planned for you." She started singing these hymns. She was rocking back and forth and holding my hand and just singing these hymns and just telling me how I was supposed to be here and God wasn't finished with my life yet. Next thing you know, I woke up the next morning and my doctor was standing at the end of my bed and he's like, "Good morning." And I remember thinking, I felt so good and light. I didn't feel that darkness. I didn't feel sick in my stomach. It's like my body shifted, my mind shifted, my spirit shifted. I was happy. And he said, "You look amazing. You must have had a good night." And I said, "I did." I said, I wanted you to thank my night nurse. And I told him what she'd done. And he said, "Well, here, so she's probably still on." It was early in the morning. So he came back in with this young nurse, blonde, petite, blue-eyed. And I looked at him and I looked at her and I said, "No, that's not my night nurse." And she said, "No, I was your nurse." And I looked over beside me to look at the rocking chair, and it was not a rocking chair. It was a regular chair. And I looked at my doctor, and he kind of smiled, and he came over and he sat down and he said, "You must have had a visitor." And I said, I must have. So I shared the story with him, and he kind of smiled and nodded. And he said, "Maybe it was a hallucination." And I thought maybe so. But what I determined in my own belief system is I do believe that was an angel. And I do believe it was an angel embodied in kind of a likeness of Maya Angelou. When I told my parents, when they came out, my mom found this black ceramic angel with a, a cowboy hat on that I still carry today. I'm looking at it right now, just as a reminder of that visit that I had and when my light came back on.
Can I ask you a couple questions about this situation?
Sure.
Do you think your husband changed or did you change?
You mean before or after?
Yeah, but when things started getting cold, was it him that was changing, or were you changing, and you perceived him differently, or was it he changed?
I think that we probably both did. I think the situation, I became so fixed on having a child no matter what, that I even went against my own body. I think that it was probably, we grew apart on it. He saw how much I was suffering, and I'm sure he was suffering emotionally as well. And watching me, I think the situation changed both of us.
For someone that's never been in that dark of a place before, I've been there. I did something similar to what you did many years ago. But how would you describe it to someone? And and in retrospect, looking back, at least in my situation, it was really the most self-absorbed act I could have done, because I didn't think about anybody. I just wanted the pain to stop. That was it.
Yeah. I mean, depression is a hope stealer. And your thinking and your mental ability is very distorted, as you know. So I believe it was the same thing for me, and then I know others, is that you're not thinking clearly. You're not thinking about anybody else. The pain is so excruciating that that's all you feel and see. And also, people, you've heard them say that they feel like it's actually a selfless act for people who take their lives by suicide because they feel like there's such a burden to those around them. But we have to be careful when we say it was it's self-absorbed, because that's what creates a stigma today about it. And that's what keeps people who are in that kind of pain believing that they can't ask for help. So it's something that I'm very careful about. And I know there's two different ways of thinking about it, but most people can understand physical pain, right? Most of us had some physical pain, but not a lot of people have ever dealt with a mental or emotional pain of such despair and hopelessness that you're out of your mind and you think the only way out is to take your own life.
Right. So if you don't want to call it self-absorbed, that's just how I view myself. I'm not speaking about anybody else.
Yeah.
What would you call it then? What would be a good way that wouldn't be a stigma?
I think it's just a painful act. It's just it's an act that you want to stop the pain. And it's also, oh boy, something I tell kids around here too that deal with this is they don't understand that the pain is temporary and that you can move out of it because all you focus on. And so once you do an impulsive act, that's what it is, because it's an impulsive act to just treating that kind of pain that you're going through right now, not realizing that there's other ways and there's other emotions that can come in after it. Most kids, and we lose suicide mainly are young kids between 15 and 24. It's usually before their frontal cortex is even fully developed yet. And that frontal cortex gives them reasoning. And, they have a belief that this pain is going to always be there, which it's not. Now, there are some people that do live in this continual pain. There's some kind of a chemical imbalance or depression that's not being treated. And so they'll have longer periods. But I always tell people, don't judge. I used to judge people when I was going, talking about my faith and talking about how God was so big in my life and how I had the light and no darkness could, befall me and I could pick myself back up. I used to judge people that even had bad days. And I realized that's not a loving act, a loving way to be, because you never know when some incident or some situation could hit you, because we all have the ability to have some situation like that hit us, and we don't know exactly how we're going to act. So keeping that light of compassion for others and understanding, I think, is much more helpful than anybody even judging ourselves, which I hear you say too, because we have to be careful even when that happens within ourselves to say, boy, I felt like that was so stupid. It was so guilty. Beating yourself up for it doesn't help either, or looking at yourself like less than. It just was. But forgiving yourself and giving yourself compassionate self-forgiveness, I think, is so important.
I didn't fully understand how judgmental I was. I did I don't really call it a retreat because it wasn't very pleasant, but I did a 10-day Vipassana course last year. So in that setting, there's no talking, there's no reading, no writing, nothing. You don't even gesture to each other. It's complete silence. You can talk to the assistant teachers, but that's it. So what I discovered very quickly is I'm an extremely judgmental person, especially if we're sitting at lunch. You're having breakfast, lunch. There's really no dinner, but I'm sitting there and I'm judging people I've never even exchanged a word with, and I was doing it constantly. So I think maybe a lot of us do that. We don't realize it because there is so much of a cloud of thoughts, and we don't even recognize this judgmental thing we're doing. I saw it. So I've been working on it. I've still got a ways to go, but it's interesting you say that. And that turns on us too. We turn that judgment on ourselves.
Yes.
And we're harder on ourselves than anybody. What's that saying? If you had a friend that talked to you the way you talk to yourself, you wouldn't be friends with that person.
That's true. Yes. I agree. And I think that's the beginning of how we can discipline ourselves. I know a lot of my coaching, I teach people is whatever you're thinking is what you're creating. So if someone comes to me and they say, well, this is what my world looks like and it's all negative. And they'll say, but I believe that, more positive things are happening. I'm a happy person. I'm a positive person. I talk, positive thoughts to me. I look and I say, that's not true. Because what you think and what you say and what you do is what you create. So if you look around your outside world and the external environment, that represents all of your thoughts, all of your beliefs, all of your words, all of it. And that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, I know, because we don't want to sometimes take responsibility for what we've created in our lives. But the good news is when we do, we can change our thoughts and our patterns and our limiting beliefs, and we can create the life we truly want after we've course corrected that that's what we deserve.
Do you think we actually physically create our world from our thoughts, or is it just we somehow surround ourselves with environments and other people, or do we actually really create our world from our thoughts?
I happen to believe that we create our world from our own thoughts. And it's usually what happens is we get stuck in our limiting beliefs. We say we want an abundant, wonderful life, and we put that out there. That's what we want, but that's not what we're telling ourselves. A lot of times we're telling ourselves, I don't really deserve that, or I'm not really good enough to do that, or that's for other people to have. I just need to, I'm just happy having this little sliver over here, even though I'm not happy. you know, this is what I truly believe. So to get people to change their outside circumstances, it has to match their inner reality. Because whatever their inner reality is what's going to match the outside. And you can change that. But I believe you change it from your limiting beliefs first.
I'm assuming that's part of what you do as a coach. You help people address that.
Yes, yes, I do. And I work with, as you know, I just recently started sharing the story that I just shared with you guys with. I used to be ashamed of it. I held it as a secret. And I held a lot of things as a secret inside. I didn't want people to know about me for fear of being judged and or think of me as being less than because I did that, some 20 years ago. Then I must be blah, blah, blah. But what I realized is when I forgave myself and I gave myself compassion, self-forgiveness as I knew God did, and I talked about something that was a secret, it ended up being a blessing. Because if I could help somebody else in an audience or reading a book or listening to a podcast, wow, I've had those thoughts, or that's happened to me too. And I'm still over here, still beating myself up over it. But it's like, no, don't do that. You don't need to do that. You can forgive yourself and talk about it because there's a lot of hurting people out in the world. And if we share our stories only from strength instead of vulnerability, it's harder for people to believe that it can happen for them too. You know what I'm saying? You are more accessible to people by talking about your authenticity.
Oh, absolutely. I believe it. And I had a previous podcast guest, a gentleman, Robert Harrion, who had a tremendous battle with cancer. He's still battling it in many ways. But one thing he said that really stuck with me, he said, as I've become more vulnerable and shared more of my story and more of what was going on, I am healing myself. I am ministering myself.
That's so true, Rich. I deal with a lot of kids in their 20s and men and women, but I've recently been working with young women in their 20s who have either tried to end their life or were not successful, or women who are dealing with depression or just lack of purpose in their lives and feeling of giving up. And when I share with them my story, I see them sitting up straighter, see them leaning in more because I'm being real with them. And they feel like, okay, if she went that low and she came up this high, then there's hope for me. So you take that hopelessness and you create hope for others because you're that example. So anytime that I can share that story and any other things in my life that I overcame, and I became empowered by those acts, empowered by being a better person, and empowered that's a lot stronger than being a victim, because I could have gone down that road as well. I could have, which is why I went to the USM and got my master's in spiritual psychology. Later in life, and after I had my own children, I went back and I was angry at my mother. I was pissed off and I couldn't stand her. And I was mad that my father had passed and that it wasn't her. And I was living with that for a couple of years. And I thought, I can't do this. I cannot hang on to this. So that's why I went to the school to learn about spiritual practices, how to forgive. And I did forgive her. And it was an inner process that I worked on. So when I came out of it, she and I went on our first mother-daughter trip ever in our lives. And I forgave her. And I realized, and I thanked her for being my greatest teacher. She told me, she said, nobody could have beaten themselves up harder than what she did herself. And I didn't want that. She's in her 80s now. I don't want her to feel that. I want her to feel like she was loved and I have compassion and that she dealt with a lot of stuff that I would never know. But her daughter loved her. And if I could forgive her, and essentially I had to forgive myself, then I wasn't the victim anymore.
So you feel you've come full circle with your mother? You feel content with where you're at in your relationship?
Yes.
So let's go back to when you're in that hospital room and you start to get a bit of light back in your life. What did you do then?
Well, I ended up thinking, okay, I was grateful I was alive. I did feel like God had a purpose in my life after all, and I needed to go about finding it and be grateful for what had happened. So I went back to Texas, and my parents helped me heal. And I ended up moving to Sun Valley. I left LA. I didn't even go back to the house where he and I were living because it became a dark house for me. And I just wanted to heal in Sun Valley, which is so incredibly beautiful here. And I did. And within a year, I met somebody who I call him my baby daddy. And the minute we were together, I got pregnant. We have two incredible, beautiful children, teenagers. I have a teenage boy who's 16 years old and teenage girl. She's 14 years old. And they are the lights of my life, my heartbeats. So I was blessed. So I decided at that time in the hospital room, I was going to give my life purpose, find it, and go out and help people because I felt like I'd been given a chance, a second chance. So it has a happy ending for me. And my ex-husband, unfortunately, died from liver cancer about 5 years after we divorced. But he and I actually got together about a year before he died and forgave each other and cried and talked about what had happened. It was tough for him to see me get pregnant and be with this other man and have these two children, but he embraced it and he was genuinely happy for me. And I went to his funeral with my children. I saw my stepdaughter, who I hadn't seen for a while. She was grown, and her mother. And, we came to a healing full circle within that family. So I feel like that entire relationship and family that, I gained so much. And I told Steve before he died, I said, I want to tell you something. I want to thank you for two things. First of all, that you woke up the desire in me to want to be a mother. And I found it first through his beautiful daughter, my stepdaughter. And that was the first gift. And the second gift was to bring me to Sun Valley, where I eventually met the man that I had my children with and where I live now. So I had a chance to say thank you. And, we both held each other and appreciated whatever lessons we needed to learn, we did learn. So that was something that was extremely important to me as well.
Do you have a relationship with your stepdaughter now?
Loosely. As a matter of fact, I'm going to California in a couple of weeks. And so we're trying to get together and see if we can visit each other. She's a wonderful young woman now. And I also told her thank you. And she's she's been a babysitter to my kids here and there. But I know. But I wanted her to know how important her role was in my life too. And I know I was important in her life. Her mom shared that with me, and so is Danielle.
Let's talk about what you're doing now as a coach. Kind of briefly touched on it. Who are you looking for? Who is your ideal client, or who do you think you could help the most?
Well, I'm what you call a soul-centered life coach.
Could you explain that?
Sure. So it's basically, it's not just talk therapy. It's what I learned in this school at University of Santa Monica, where I got my master's, and their tools and techniques. So if someone comes to me and says, I'm just not happy, I want to find my purpose, or maybe they have problems. They've got, problems. They're on drugs or they're on alcohol or whatever. So instead of just fixing the symptoms, what a soul-centered life coach does is we look under the symptoms and find the root cause of the problem. And it generally goes back to childhood. I don't believe in years of talk therapy and you sit on the couch and, try to figure things out. People can move through some situations, in some painful situations, and release them and let them go so they can move on in their life. And I just happen to have, a toolbox of things that can help people do that. I work with all ages. My client base, runs the gamut from, 16-year-old girl to a 75-year-old woman. It's all the same. We all want to feel loved and we want to feel joy in our lives. So whatever we've done in between those years of living, and we picked up some bad habits or some, like I said, limiting beliefs, we can clear those so we can move on and get you to that place where your happiness is returned, where your joy is returned, and where you find the purpose in your life. And I've seen transformations in people, so I know this stuff works. And of course, I know it works because it did with me.
Could you tell us a little bit? You started a suicide prevention task force, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So after I graduated, I was actually getting ready to go out and teach, women's empowerment groups and workshops. But I received a phone call from a friend of mine whose partner had died by suicide. And I was shocked. And what I didn't tell you is that the Sun Valley has a very high rate of suicide, as most mountain towns do, for a variety of reasons. And there was a boy in my son's class in 8th grade who took his life. My children, the ages between 12 and 14, they lost 5 people who were close to them. And that last one that I received the phone call happened to be my kids are avid ski racers. They had a mentor, and Caleb is his name, and they were close to Caleb. He taught them how to make their own skis, and he was only 40 years old, and the kids loved him. So when I heard that, I came back home to Sun Valley, and I started asking questions and started talking to leaders and people in hospitals and, first responders, like, why do we have this problem? And I found out we didn't really have any great protocols set up with the hospital and some other things, preventive things that we could be doing in the schools. And so I got into the middle of it just because it was a calling to me. So I started this task force, which we just got a new name as of today. This morning, as a matter of fact, I was in a board meeting. So we're called 5B Suicide Prevention Alliance. And the 5B is just kind of a county term that we have here in Sun Valley. And our sole purpose is to have education about suicide prevention and get it into the schools, into as many people as we can, so that we can lower the suicide rates in the state. We're 5th in the nation.
In Idaho?
Idaho is 5th in the nation, highest.
And how many people live in Idaho?
There's only about 20,000 people, so it's per capita. Just in our, community, we were much higher. We were probably 3rd in the nation. Aspen was right up there, Park City. There's a whole area of 13 states called the Suicide Belt. It's in the western region, part of the United States. And so all the governors are getting together, and a lot of task forces are being formed as to what's happening, how can we all get involved and spread the awareness and let people know there's help. So we're moving from this meistic society into, if you know somebody who is having a difficult time and you suspect that they could be suicidal, what do? And we teach kids this, we teach this whole curriculum, because what you really do is you get involved. You don't just say, hey, this isn't my problem. No, that's what's wrong with society. What we do is we look around to those we love and see and care about and say, how can I help you? And by the way, I'm concerned that you're in such a bad way that have you thought about suicide? 99% of the time they will tell you yes. And then the next question is, what is your plan? And they will tell you. And then the third thing you tell them is that you are here, you are going to stay with them, you're going to help them get some help, and you get them to a mental care provider, or you call the suicide hotline with them. You never leave them alone, Rich. You just don't do that. You stay committed to them and help them get the help that they need. Just that one caring action can make the biggest difference in the world to somebody, because they just want to know somebody truly cares and can help them. Most of them, that's all they need. And you don't have to be certified. You don't have to worry about, gosh, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. All the simple answer to that is you show someone love. You show them that you care. You talk about it and you let them know that their life means something.
I think the challenge with what you're trying to do too now is maybe not that people don't care or don't want to get involved. It's just there's an endless stream of distraction in our culture, and that's not going to change. But you got to just stop for a minute and stop thinking about what's going on in my head and be aware of what's going on around you, perhaps.
Yes. I mean, and that's the caring and compassionate part, and that's the problem that we're having to deal with. And even with our kids, like putting our phones down, looking at each other in the eyes and saying, you matter, you care. And that's the humanity in us. That's not ever going to change until we become computers. But we're still human beings. And the connectivity and the compassion are the two C's that are the most important.
I wanted to ask you one last question.
Sure.
Before all this journey began, and if you could go back and talk to the younger Pirie before all this journey began, what would you say to her?
I've done this in a couple of my classes for various times in my life, but I think if I was to sit down with her right now, I would say, honey, we're getting ready to go on a wild ride. You're going to experience some good things and some bad things, but always remember that you're never alone. God is always with you, and we can always find a solution to everything, and don't give up. You are very loved, and yes, you deserve to be living here today, and I'm so glad you were born, because you're a gift.
Well, that's very nice. I think we'll end it with that. I want to thank you for sharing part of your story. I could probably talk to you for another 5 hours, but either you or I don't have that time.
I know.
But I want to thank you for sharing your story. And, going back to what you said, the main reason I started this podcast is I wanted to do this for people that if they heard your story and they said, oh, well, Pirie survived this, then so can I. I mean, it's just, that's the main reason I started, honestly. So
I think that's a beautiful reason. And thank you, Rich, for doing the work that you're doing, and certainly for having me on your show. And, if we can help one person, that's so worth it.
That's for sure. That's for sure. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for listening. And please leave any comments or suggestions. We're always looking for ways to improve our show and make it the best show it can possibly be. Visit mindfulaccord.com, where you can find additional episodes and you can follow our blog. We give some helpful information on mindfulness, meditation, and just ways to manage our everyday stressful lives. And most importantly, if you know of a friend or a family member that would benefit from this story, please share it with them. Until next time, I'm Rich Decker.